There's something deeply ironic about the times we live in. We've mapped the human genome, photographed black holes, landed autonomous machines on distant planets, and taught algorithms to mimic the patterns of human thought. We carry in our pockets more computing power than NASA had during the Apollo missions. And yet, amid all this progress, one question remains stubbornly unanswered. Why do so many people feel lost? In an age where we can transmit data across continents in milliseconds, it still takes a lifetime, sometimes longer, for a person to understand themselves. We've mastered the transfer of information, but we still wrestle with the acquisition of wisdom. We've wired the globe for hyperconnectivity, yet remain emotionally unplugged from one another. We simulate life in pixels and code, but rarely pause to reflect on the internal world of thought and perception. We've become architects of convenience, but still wake up asking, what does it all mean? This is the paradox of progress. With every leap forward in our external capabilities, we seem to expose a corresponding gap in our internal clarity. It's not merely a psychological issue, nor is it only philosophical. It touches something deeper, something structural, cognitive, a kind of perceptual error embedded not in our devices, but in our very mode of awareness. You could think of it as a veil, not one woven from cloth, but one composed of assumptions, cultural narratives, and inherited beliefs. Not placed over us by a puppet master, but co-constructed by all of us, generation after generation. A collective lens through which we see the world, and more critically, through which we don't see it. We are the only known species capable of constructing models of reality that extend beyond immediate experience. We build languages, philosophies, mythologies, and sciences, not just to survive, but to understand. Yet, sometimes, the very frameworks we create to explore truth become the very structures that limit our access to it. We begin to confuse the map with the terrain. We mistake models for reality, metaphors for mechanisms, symbols for systems, and in doing so, we fall asleep within our own constructs. We accept routine in place of reflection. We inherit ideologies instead of interrogating them. This, in essence, is the veil. But beyond that veil is not fantasy. It is reality measurable, observable, yet often overlooked. Take the cosmos itself. More than 95% of it is composed of dark matter and dark energy elements we cannot directly detect, but whose gravitational effects are unmistakable. This isn't mysticism. It's astrophysics. Just as the moon moves the tides without ever touching the water, there are unseen forces shaping human behavior, social, psychological, environmental, moving silently beneath our conscious awareness. And if we don't acknowledge them, we risk living lives driven more by reflex than by reason. Here's a fact grounded in biology. Your eyes perceive only a narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. Your ears detect only a narrow band of vibrations. Your brain filters sensory data to prioritize survival, not truth. So the question isn't whether there's more to reality. The question is, what are we systematically ignoring? When you begin asking that question, not as a slogan, but as a scientific imperative, your world begins to shift. Not because a new universe appears, but because you begin to detect layers that were always there, just filtered out by a nervous system optimized for efficiency rather than insight. Thinkers throughout history, from early philosophers to modern neuroscientists, have pointed to this cognitive filter. What we call reality is often a consensus, a shared hallucination reinforced by repetition and tradition. We're born into systems economic, linguistic, ideological, and taught from an early age what is real, what is desirable, and what is off limits. By adulthood, many of our beliefs aren't conclusions we arrived at through reasoning, but patterns we absorbed without question. Our thoughts echo previous generations, not because we're inherently unoriginal, but because repetition is evolution's shortcut. It's efficient, but it's not always true. The most critical illusion, then, isn't external manipulation. It's the illusion of separation, the belief that you are fundamentally isolated from others, from nature, from the cosmos. That illusion, more than any technology or government, perpetuates division. Because when you feel separate, you fear. And when you fear, you comply. You stop exploring. You settle for what's given. But here's where the science gets fascinating. The very capacity to notice the dissonant stretto, feel that gap between what you've been told and what you sense might be true, isn't dysfunction, it's a signal. It's what cognitive scientists call metacognition, the ability to think about your thinking. That quiet voice inside you that questions, that wonders, that resists default modes, that's not your weakness. That's your upgrade. And once it's activated, it's hard to switch off. You start seeing the layers. You recognize bias in the media. You hear fear in the voice of authority. You notice when moral outrage is used as a mask for control. You begin to distinguish between programming and perception, between stimulus and self-awareness. That discomfort you feel, it's not a glitch. It's the beginning of awakening. Not spiritual transcendence in a mystical sense, but the awakening of the scientific mind. The observer who steps back from the narrative and starts to ask, what's the evidence, what's the mechanism, what's the cost of not knowing? But let's be clear, awakening is not about escaping the world. It's about becoming more engaged with it, more curious, more informed, more aware of the systems in which we live. The aim isn't to transcend reality, but to perceive it more accurately, to look at the code economic, cultural, neurological, and ask, is this still serving us? Because many of the systems that govern our lives, toady your schools, our institutions, our technologies, were designed in an era that no longer exists. They were built for stability, not adaptability, for control, not curiosity, for repetition, not revelation. And now they're struggling to keep up with a species undergoing exponential change. But here's the cosmic twist. You are not a bystander in this evolutionary leap. You are not simply a passenger in the ship of civilization. You are part of its propulsion system. The universe doesn't evolve without its components, and you are one of them. A pocket of conscious matter with the unique capacity to reflect, to revise, and to reimagine. That capacity is not mystical, it's neurological, it's cognitive, and it is the most powerful tool we possess. The ability to think beyond instinct, to question inherited assumptions, to choose not only how we respond to the world, but how we shape it. This is not about rejecting science or embracing spirit. It's about recognizing that perception is a scientific variable. That observation changes outcome. In quantum physics, we call it the observer effect. In human behavior, we call it awareness. And in both realms, it is the root of transformation. You don't need to abandon reason to live meaningfully. In fact, meaning emerges because you reason, because you notice patterns, because you care enough to ask what's real and what's constructed. And that act alone of choosing to see more clearly is where freedom begins. It's easy to feel overwhelmed when you begin to see the complexity. You recognize the inertia of outdated institutions, the entanglement of politics and psychology, the scale of ecological and technological challenges, and you think, what can one person possibly do? But this is precisely where science meets significance. Because in complex systems, change doesn't always begin with mass movements. Sometimes it begins with small shifts in initial conditions. In chaos theory, it's known as the butterfly effect, the idea that a tiny variation in one part of a system can lead to significant changes in another. That's not poetic metaphor. That's mathematics. And if that's true in weather systems, it's true in social systems. And if it's true in social systems, it's true in personal systems. Your attention, where you place it, what you focus on, what you amplify is not trivial, it is causal. You are not just reacting to the world, you are feeding it information. Through your behaviors, your choices, your conversations, your silence, you are participating in the feedback loops that define what reality becomes next. Think of it this way. Consciousness is energy. Not in a mystical sense, but in the most literal way. Your brain consumes about 20% of your body's energy budget. Why? Because paying attention is work. And like any energy system, what you energize becomes active. What you neglect withers. So the question becomes, what are you energizing with your attention? Fear? Division? Cynicism? Or are you directing that energy toward inquiry, toward understanding, toward solutions? Because just as entropy's tendency toward disorder is a law of physics, so too is the fact that complex systems require energy inputs to maintain structure. And in the human realm, that input is consciousness. Focused, informed, intentional thought is the organizing principle that pushes back against cultural entropy. You don't need to be famous. You don't need a platform. You don't even need a perfect plan. What you need is coherence. When your thoughts, your values, and your actions are aligned, you emit a kind of signal into the systemone that others can sense. One that disrupts noise. One that reshapes norms. That's not mysticism. That's emergent behavior. And it is how systems, biological, social, even cosmic, adapt, evolve, and thrive. But let's clarify something that often gets misunderstood. Gaining clarity seeing through the noise is not a badge of superiority. It doesn't make you more enlightened than others. It makes you more accountable. Because with clearer vision comes greater responsibility, not just for your own choices, but for the impact those choices have on the larger system. Once you understand that your thoughts influence outcomes, that your behavior shapes culture, and that your silence reinforces status quo, you can't pretend otherwise. You can't unknow what you now see. This is the real weight of awareness. It's not a spiritual awakening, it's a maturity awakening, a transition from being a consumer of reality to being a co-author of it. And this kind of maturity is exactly what our species needs right now. Not louder opinions, but deeper inquiries. Not more tribes, but more systems thinkers. People who understand that problems don't exist in isolation, and neither do solutions. So yes, when you begin to question deeply why things are the way they are, who benefits from dysfunction, what narratives are incentivized it, can feel disorienting. You may even feel disillusioned, but disillusionment isn't a failure, it's an upgrade. It means you've shed an illusion. And in a world built on inherited models, that is progress. Because the only thing more dangerous than a bad system is a system you never realized existed. Science doesn't advance by comfort, it advances by disruption, by people who question what others took for granted. Galileo didn't invent the moons of Jupiter, he simply refused to look away from what he saw through the telescope. And that same principle applies inward. Refusing to look away from what your own perception is telling you, that's where the real revolution begins. In neuroscience, we once believed that consciousness was a byproduct of the brain-like smoke rising from a fire. But emerging research suggests a more nuanced picture. Some scientists now propose that the brain might not create consciousness, but rather tune into it like a radio picking up signals from a deeper broadcast. This doesn't mean throwing science out the window. Quite the opposite. It means expanding the frame, because as we explore the quantum world, we find something astonishing. The universe is not built from isolated particles. It's built from relationships, fields of interaction, waves of probability, entangled states that defy classical logic. Quantum entanglement shows that particles can influence each other instantaneously across vast distances. The implication? Reality is not as local, as fixed, or as separate as it once seemed. So now the question isn't just what is the universe made of, but what is it doing through us? Because if you think about it, your thoughts, your feelings, your dreams, what are they, if not vibrational patterns within a biological field? Your brain is electrochemical. Your heart emits measurable electromagnetic signals. Your entire body is an information system nested within larger information systems. Family, culture, ecosystem, planet, galaxy. This isn't mysticism. It's systems science. It's cybernetics. It's what happens when a complex system gains the ability to reflect on itself. And that's what you are. You are not merely a passenger in the universe. You are the part of the universe that can ask questions about itself. You are the localized awareness of a system so vast it bends light. A temporary configuration of atoms capable of wonder, ethics, and choice. And once you see this, not just understand it intellectually, but feel it viscerally, you begin to change how you show up. You stop outsourcing responsibility. You stop blaming abstract forces. You realize that every reaction is a signal. Every belief is an instruction. Every emotion is a feedback loop. You are not just interpreting the world, You are participating in it structurally. Once you understand that you are not separate from the universe, but a node within its evolving intelligence, your mindset shifts. You stop asking, why is the world this way? And begin asking, how am I contributing to the way the world appears? Because every belief you reinforce, every assumption you accept, every emotion you broadcast, whether consciously or not, feeds back into the collective signal. And that signal, in turn, shapes what we collectively call reality. This is not philosophy alone. In physics, we know the observer effect. The act of observation alters the behavior of the observed. But what's rarely discussed is how this scales up. In society, observation isn't just passive awareness, it's active reinforcement. What you pay attention to, you amplify. What you ignore, you allow. What you deny, you prolong. So if your attention is a kind of currency, what are you funding with it? Every time you click, speak, argue, consume, or stay silent, you are casting a vote not for a politician, but for a version of reality. You are instructing the system on what to perpetuate. And here's the beautiful twist. That means you're never powerless. Even if you can't control global events, you can control the quality of your signal, and systems respond to signal integrity. In physics, it's called coherence. In human terms, it's when your thoughts, emotions, and actions are aligned. You become a tuning fork in a field of noise, a stabilizing frequency in a chaotic feedback loop. This is not magic, it's mathematics. Coherence creates resonance, and resonance reorganizes systems not through force, but through structure. The more clearly you think, the more intentionally you act, the more aligned you live, the more impact you have, not because you shouted louder, but because your presence itself became constructive. Now, let's be clear. Clarity doesn't arrive in a flash of cosmic lightning. It comes in increments, in recalibrations, like adjusting a telescope peanut to invent new stars, but to bring the existing ones into sharper focus. The same principle applies inward. You don't wake up one day with perfect perception. You tune it slowly, methodically, iteratively. You start noticing pattern show fear masquerades as morality, how outrage is monetized, how distraction is engineered. You begin to see that much of what passes for normal was designed not for liberation, but for compliance. And so the questions deepen, not abstract ones, but surgical ones. Who benefits when I'm afraid? Who profits when I feel unworthy? Who gains control when I relinquish mine without asking why? These aren't conspiracy theories. These are patterns. And pattern recognition is the heartbeat of science. You're not inventing a new world. You're detecting the one that's been obscured. That's why seeing more clearly doesn't make you a prophet. It makes you a scientist of the self, someone who refuses to accept inherited assumptions as absolute truths, someone who views their own conditioning not as identity, but as data to be questioned, rewritten, upgraded. And that act, the continual refinement of perception ease, one of the most scientifically responsible things you can do, because clearer observers generate better outcomes, not just in laboratories, but in communities, in families, in ecosystems, in civilizations. You don't need to transcend the human condition. You need to engage it with greater fidelity, greater accuracy, greater coherence. That's not spiritual escapism. That's intellectual maturity. Because once you begin to see clearly, you don't withdraw from the world, you step into it more deliberately. You don't preach louder, you embody more precisely. You don't seek control, you radiate stability. This is the paradox of awakened perception. You speak less to be heard and more to convey meaning. You consume less to escape and more to nourish. You no longer chase validation, you generate coherence. You stop defining yourself by titles, by politics, by traumas, by tribes, not because they're meaningless, but because they're insufficient. They may describe your surface, but they don't define your core. You begin to act less from habit and more from alignment. And in doing so, your influence shifts, not by force, not by charisma, but by field resonance. You become a point of clarity in a culture of noise, a stable frequency in a turbulent system. And people feel that even if they can't explain it, they sense the precision in your presence. the alignment in your action, the absence of pretense. That's not mysticism. That's gravitational integrity. The same way a star bends space-time around it, coherence bends probability. Systems organize around stable attractors, and in the human field, that attractor is conscious alignment. This is why the most transformative people in history weren't always the loudest, the richest, or the most credentialed. They were the most coherent. Their thoughts, values, and actions were not in conflict. And that coherence transmitted across families, communities, generations. You don't need to fix the world. You need to stabilize your signal within it. Because when enough nodes in a system reach coherence, the system reorganizes. It tips. It transitions. Not by decree, but by resonance. You see, the universe is not something separate from you. It's not a backdrop against which your life unfolds. It is the very structure through which your life takes shape. You are not in the cosmos. You are of its stardust, assembled by the laws of physics into a temporary configuration of thought, sensation, and choice. Carl Sagan once said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." That's not poetry. That's thermodynamics, chemistry, neurology, converging into a fact that borders on sacred consciousness didn't arise outside nature. It is nature folding in on itself. So the question is not just, what will you do with your life? It's, what will the universe do through you? Because when you live as though your attention matters, when you treat your decisions as ripples in a complex system, when you honor your awareness not as a fluke but as a force, then everything changes. Your smallest acts take on cosmic weight. Kindness is no longer sentiment, it's entropy management. Curiosity is no longer indulgent, it's intelligence expanding itself. Courage is no longer about heroism, it's about coherence in the face of chaos. And from that posture, you stop waiting for signs. You become one, not in a grandiose way, but in the quiet integrity of your choices. You become evidence that evolution is still happening, not just biologically, but consciously. You become the link between ancient stardust and future possibility. And that's the real shift, not mystical, not mythical, but measurable. When one human being chooses to live with clarity, responsibility, and resonance, it's not just a personal decision, it's a contribution to the informational architecture of the species. It's data feeding back into the system. It's feedback that says, yes, intelligence can align with empathy. Awareness can align with action. Consciousness can stabilize complexity. That is not a slogan. That is civilization. So here we are on a tiny rock orbiting an average star in an average galaxy within a universe so vast, our most powerful instruments still can't see its edge. And yet, from this improbable vantage point, something extraordinary is happening. The universe is looking back at itself through you, through your questions, your creativity, your desire to understand and improve, your struggle to align intention with impact, your refusal to accept easy answers to hard questions. This capacity for reflectionists, the most sophisticated technology the cosmos has ever produced. Not your phone, not your telescope, your consciousness, your ability to notice, to choose, to care. So don't underestimate it. Every time you resist distraction and choose focus, you increase the system's capacity for order. Every time you question inherited assumptions, you expand the boundary of known thought. Every time you act with integrity when no one is watching, you upgrade the informational signal that humanity transmits to itself. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be participating consciously, coherently, courageously. Because when you live like that, you don't just navigate the world, you help shape the parameters of what it becomes. And that is the final veil, the illusion that you are separate from the system you influence. Once you see through that, truly see it, your life doesn't just shift, it activates. You stop being a spectator of existence and become a signal of evolution. Not someday, now. So aim your awareness with the precision of a telescope. Align your choices with the elegance of orbital mechanics. Live your brief moment on this cosmic stage with the quiet power of a star-radiating energy, forming gravity, sustaining light. Because in the end, the universe is not asking you to worship it. It's asking you to participate in it intelligently, responsibly, magnificently. And that is the science of being fully alive.